Thank you so much, Rad. And thanks, Brendan. What a great way to start the day. So I'm Dan Golding, and I am a professor, as Rad emphasized. But I've also been in and around the games sector for a very long time now. Feels like, I don't know, several lifetimes actually, but have done, I guess, music for games most directly on Title Goose Game, but really, most importantly, Brendan Keogh's Putting Challenge. Anyway, so I think we will get to introducing our panel. You've already heard from Brendan, probably don't need to introduce him. We've also got Marigold Bartlett, Goldie, who's the Games Investment Manager for Screen Australia. And we've got Marie Foulston, who is studio lead, hybrid curator, creative director, executive producer at Good Afternoon in the UK. So to start us off, in the keynote, Brendan talked quite a lot about... actually, before I get to the first question, I should just set the parameters. We are going to be talking a little bit about finding your career in the changing industry, talking about opportunities and ecosystems, and particularly alternate career pathways in this panel. So, Brendan talked quite a bit about the way that games careers tend to only make sense in retrospect. And I thought that might be a good way for us to introduce ourselves, actually. You've already heard from Brendan, so I won't ask him this. But Goldie, perhaps we'll start with you. What did you want to be when you started your career, and how did you end up here?
Great question. I went to an open day at the university that I went to. I went to the School of Fine Art because I thought that's what I wanted to study out of high school. But then I realised I didn't quite want to get into sculpture and painting and sort of bigger art until I was much older. I was already drawing in Photoshop. This is 2012 or so. I wanted to continue working digitally. And I played video games, but I didn't quite realise that I didn't think that I wanted to study video games at all, but that was where you went if you wanted to draw digitally or make digital art. And so, yeah, off I went to games, do a games degree, and it turned out that it's a very fascinating culture, and I realised that maybe I'm interested in kind of cultural studies as well as art. I always really liked art history, and it turns out that video games also have a history because they're an art form. But I guess at the start of my career, I thought, well, I came to art school to do art, so I guess I want to be an art director. That's sort of where you should aim to go. Yeah, I'm not an art director. I was. I did it. But yeah, fuddled my way through all sorts of other arty things around games in the end. But yeah, that's what I wanted to be at the start of my career, was doing the art.
And how did that turn into becoming the investment manager for Screen Australia?
Great question. I think being a curious person, honestly, is my real answer to that. And caring very much about the health of students emerging young developers. I think that positions me quite well to be in a role where kind of caring a lot about the practitioners in the industry, matters. And then I think as well, just a lot of different experiences as a young artist in the Australian industry, sort of knowing who people are and what their interests and passions were, knowing what the problems are in the industry, maybe makes me a good plant at Screen Australia to help steer the ship a little bit.
Very good. Marie, same question.
Just I feel as though this morning, sort of, and the name of this session, Finding Your Game Career in a Changing Industry, I'm reading that question in this panel. I'm a little bit like that meme of, I don't know if people know the little boy that gets asked the question on the street, and he's sort of smiling at first, and then he just starts crying. Yeah. And that, if you asking me that question, I am that little boy, just sort of like, But I think being in Brendan's talk has been a bit like sort of group therapy, because I will say, if we're all if you think that it's just you that has been asked this question, it's something that we're all asking ourselves up here continuously. And thinking back to, like, how did I start in games? When did my career start? And I don't think there's actually a pin that I can put in the map in the exact same way that Brendan didn't. Because the formal places, like I started working in film and I did a degree in film, but I went into film because I dropped out of my art foundation because I failed it basically. And that meant that I couldn't get onto the animation degree that I wanted to get onto. But animation was something that I came to, I think, because of graphic design. And I don't remember what came before graphic design, but I was a young girl at some point, which I think meant that I felt like obliged to say that I wanted to be a vet. So like I wanted to be a vet maybe at some point because like animals. But the first thing that I do remember wanting to be was a scientist. And that was because I thought that science meant that you had little test tubes of things that are different colors, and that you put those different colors into another test tube and then they all fizz together and make something exciting. And I'm like, that seems like a really good career, which I think actually thinking back to it, in that, wanting to be that scientist and mix test tube stuff together, that at least for me, sort of explains where I am today. So I can't even really answer the question about where I started, because I think it's always been, and as Goldie said, it's about curiosity. It's about having a series of compass points and following those and following like your curiosity, which has kind of got me to where I am today.
Yeah, great answers. I just at this point as well want to remind people, so in this session as well, especially if you had questions from Brendan's keynote, I think as the panel we can perhaps start to direct those and answer those, but also if you have any questions, please chuck them in the Slido. I can see there's quite a few already, and we'll definitely be getting to those throughout the panel as best as we can. I suppose, also just throw my own quick answer to my own question as well. I started off, I think, wanting to be a games journalist or some kind of journalist, some kind of critic, I think, a writer about culture, about games, about film, about music, and did that for a little while, especially while I was a PhD student at the same time, which again was not that I really wanted to get into academia as an end goal. It was more like, I like studying, I'll do that more. And that's kind of led me here. But then along the way, I went to a thing called the Free Play Independent Games Festival here in Melbourne as a critic, as a writer, as a journalist, and then ended up running it. And then again at an event running Free Play, there were some game devs there, House, and they were working on their first game, and I asked them what they were going to do for music. And the next day, I was a video game composer. So it's sort of all been a bit of a roundabout path, as I think has been the key takeaway from Brendan's talk. But I wanted to ask, there is a question that's come through that's been upvoted right to the top, and actually it's a variant of a question that I was going to ask. When we talk about these careers being so unpredictable and making sense only in retrospect, how do we then, this question is about schools and teachers, but I think we can expand that to be about society and funding and institutions. How do we support those careers if they're so unpredictable? Hey, Goldie, you do investment. Why don't I go to you first?
The first thing that springs to mind for me was, I have this memory of it being third year student at RMIT at the end of my degree, and standing in the office of one of my professors and saying to him, hey, I'm a bit scared of what comes next. What does it mean to be successful? And I could see all of these different variations of what successful was supposed to be, whether that's a full-time job at Activision or whatever, working on some massive game, or having lots of money, or not having to worry about anything ever again. And his answer at the time was, look, if you're able to make rent through art, you're successful. And I clung to that for the entirety of my 20s, and it just sort of inspired me enough to keep doing my best to get a little bit of work, enough to contribute at least towards my rent at the start of my career, and then to fully fund just living in share houses and being a human. So a little bit of encouragement to just continue to follow the passion is going to be hugely beneficial, I think, in an education setting. When I was teaching at RMIT later, I reused that same line on a lot of the students who were really anxious about exactly the same thing, and just said, look, if you want to be here, if you want to do your best work, all you have to do is dedicate yourself to treating it like a practice. It's an ongoing, it's a craft. It's something that you need to shape and work at to get better at. And I would also always encourage them to, like you said in your talk as well, build community, which just means to support the work of the people around you, find opportunities to put your work together, and throw parties or exhibitions around it, so you drum up the noise around it. It's sort of, I guess, like, if you could boil it down to keep it very real and lean into DIY culture whilst you're emerging. Take care of yourself, I guess.
Brendan?
Yeah, I think both Goldie and Marie, you both said about curiosity is really important. I was thinking back to my own slides in relation to that, about when I just make stuff or have it be like, all that is about like being curious, whether it's curious about, what about if I make this game, or what if I play around with this tool, or what if I try making a game about this poultry, just having questions and then exploring that. And so then what can educators do, and institutions and funding, and generally is just like, what can you do to foster the opportunity to be curious? And so where that's for educators, so like when I was teaching game design, I really put a lot of focus on not making a big game at the end of semester or at the end of the degree, but just making just another small game and having really hard restrictions, like it must be playable in 5 minutes, or, it must, have this very small thing, just to like, in kind of, I was going to say enforce curiosity, but foster curiosity. And like, because often you'd get students who are just like, no, I need to figure out how to get a job at Activision. And it's like, no, you need to figure out how to develop a craft. And so be curious and ask curious questions, because you can't aim for it in a very linear way. And then on the funding side as well, it's like, well, what can you do to make curiosity more feasible and less risky, right? So whether that's having a bit of funding available, or having kind of public infrastructure like healthcare where you can actually take a risk on a game for a few years. When I interview Australian developers, we're like, I'm 20, I'm just going to have a go at this for a bit and see what happens. And then I would interview an American game developer, and they're like, I need a job, or I die if I get a cold. And it's like, because I don't have healthcare. And so like, it just wasn't, you couldn't take the risks creatively because you weren't financially able to. So just creating that support is important.
I suppose I should speak a little bit about some of the support available to Australian game developers through Screen Australia. We currently have a small budget to work with every year, and the way that we choose to spend that is by giving out 2 different types of grants throughout the year. One is a grant of up to $30,000 specifically for emerging game makers, and we are looking for challenging, bold, exciting work that doesn't necessarily need to have a commercial angle. It's for emerging developers to learn, practice, and try out their wild ideas. We want to support that. The other is a slightly larger amount of funding. It's up to $100,000. That's for more of it's the game's production fund. So again, not necessarily needing to have that commercial angle. Nice to have, but we know it's a small drop in the ocean. But funding is available to the emergers.
And Goldie, on that, just because you've brought it up, there is a question here about Screen Australia's grants and support, but particular if there's any way that schools can help students get funded, or an internship or pathway into industry.
I'm very aware I'm at the Careers and Frontiers Games Education Symposium, but unfortunately, students are ineligible to apply.
Right. So perhaps that's more of a tertiary level. Yeah, sure. Cool. Well, good to know. And Marie?
Oh my God, there's just asking, going back to the first question about sort of where the finance and the funding and sort of the support for this sort of comes from. So many really big questions within there. And I think people have touched on this. And I think for me, and thinking about sort of my perspective and going through this, and I remember sort of, again, sort of thinking back to when I was at university, and I do now see so many more parallels between somebody who was at the time seeking a career in the film industry, which is much more understood to be a cultural medium and a cultural area than I think sort of games is. And I think Brendan's keynote sort of really touched upon that. But one of the things that I remember staying with me was one of our lecturers or one of our sort of course leaders sort of saying to us that there was sort of two types of way of sort of succeeding or finding a path, and one was the sort of auteur route of like, if you really want to become the director, if you really want to go that creative route, it is going to be brutally hard and you are going to have to work so hard for it. And that saying like it is possible, but knowing sort of how really challenging and difficult that route was going to be. But on the other side, and one of the things that I don't think enough people spoke to us about was that there was this whole other cultural ecosystem that existed around films, and there's a whole other industrial ecosystem that existed around films that it was also possible to work within. And I think for me, it's like I don't quite, looking back, sort of agree that there is this sort of binary of the two things that you can work towards. But I think when we're working in a cultural medium, when we look at like a lot of the success stories that are put in front of us, I think it's very easy to sort of perhaps take away what is what does success look like and take away the wrong idea. And it's nice to say, I mean, not to say that you can't be sort of like thinking that you want to sort of achieve sort of the successes of sort of Goose Game, or that you want to get a job in Activision. There's nothing wrong with harboring those sort of desires, but I think looking at ways in which you can balance where money is coming from for you to be able to make rent, to make sure that you have a good work-life balance, but understanding and really interrogating what is it about the medium and about this field that is inspiring and interesting to you, and knowing that that work and that creative thing can exist in many different areas. It does not mean that you don't have to work at this sort of one big company. You don't have to make that one big game. There's other attributes and components that make up that medium, and those challenges can be found in a whole range of different areas. And I think for us sort of working, because I've worked in sort of similar roles to Goldie. I've worked for sort of creative support agencies. I've worked as a curator. There is no way that I could say where I am today is where I ever knew that I was going. But what's brought me there has been balancing, sometimes working in areas and on projects that don't sound that exciting and don't sound that interesting, but have existed around games and have meant that I've had to rely on a lot of the skills and ideas and sort of expertise that I have that I can pull from games and I can bring into those areas. And when, exactly as you say, when you look back up the path, I can see how those less interesting and perhaps less exciting roles and jobs that are sort of not often talked about and not often prioritized have helped get me to where I am today. So I think for me, it's about sort of valuing your own sort of health and your own sort of benefit and being able to prioritize a good sort of like, not work-life balance, but just a look after yourselves, but know that those pursuits and those ideas and valuable skills can come from unexpected places. Yeah.
Absolutely. We have a lot of questions, a lot of really great questions that I want to get to. And maybe this is not so much a question, but I just want to observe it because I think we'll probably come back to it. But it strikes me that everyone here keeps also coming back to the importance, even though I don't think anybody said it outright, the importance of having interests outside of games, actually. Yeah, okay, all right. That I think, filmmaking, art, poetry, and, in my case, music, I think that is something that is, it's under the surface of a lot of these discussions.
I think it often gets forgotten when video games come up because of the overarching, like, it's tech thing. It's
right.
Actually, it's very creative. And if you are a creative person, you are going to be inspired by other art forms and other ways of being creative. Lean in.
So I want to get to our top voted question at the moment, which is a really terrific one and a very curly one. I think, Brendan, I'll throw this to you. What would you say is the defining difference between people who make it in the game industry and those who don't? Sorry, what would you say is the defining difference between people who make it in the game industry and those who don't?
Goodness. Luck. Yeah. Probably, honestly, I'll work my way into a more nuanced answer, but I think it's like a little bit luck. Like, it isn't a meritocracy, I think, is one of the hard truths of any cultural sector, that you have to try hard, you have to do work, like a lot of hard work and network and everything, and it could still not work out. And there's a lot of incredibly great game developers who don't work in games anymore, or who never worked in games that still make incredible games. So, yeah, honestly, a bit of luck. And I think there's a guy, Darius Kazemi, who did a great talk at XOXO Festival over a decade ago now, called How to Win the Lottery. And it was kind of a mock, like, TED talk, kind of like inspirational thing. And he's like, I just kept buying lottery tickets, and you can too, kind of thing. And it's really funny. But it's also about, like, everything you do, like every community event you go to, every little tiny game you chuck on itch, every CV you send out for a job app or whatever is kind of another lottery ticket. And I want to encourage gambling, but, like, there's a lot of things you can't control, but, like, you can at least be in that. So I think, I don't know, it's not a great, I don't think there's any, like, specific characteristic or anything that you really need. But I think, because I don't want to, like, imply it's a meritocracy, but I think, honestly, that's probably it, which I know is a depressing answer. But something I'll add to that really quickly is just, I think, the people who are successful, and I think to try to kind of make a bit more concrete on this, it's non-linear, you'll figure it out later, is just, like, having a trajectory, not just a destination in mind. Like, not just going, like, I want to be the creative director, I want to be at Naughty Dog, or I want to, like, that can be an aspiration that you aim towards, but then, like, what's the next step in that direction? And I'm like, kind of like Marie, sorry, once you take that step, then what's your goal? And, like, when you look back, then the path's going to have gone all over the place. But, like, there's nothing wrong with having, like, goals that you're aiming for, but that can't be, the next step isn't creative director at Naughty Dog. That's, like, 20 years from now. Next step is just make a game or something like that.
The thing that the question needs breaking down, like, because what does it, wait, could you say the question again exactly as you read it?
Yes, I marked it as answered, so I'm going off memory.
Oh, okay, sorry.
But what is the difference between those who make it in the games industry?
Make it.
Yeah.
What does it mean to make it? How do we know we've
point.
made it? And you said in your talk that there was who was the guy again? No, not in the sort of main talk. You talked about the person at GCAP who stood up and had this illustrious career and was still like, I still don't know where I'm going.
Josh Sawyer.
There's no point where you're going to have made it. Like, there's no point when you're going to have made it. And what does it mean to have made it? And what does it mean to have been successful in games? Those are kind of the things that we need to break apart. That there's this idea of this win state or this win condition that we can get towards. The question should be sort of, I think, what does it mean to sort of stay in this, to stay part of this cultural community and to be sustainable and to be sort of healthy and happy? Those are the things that I think that that I know that I need to start prioritizing. And this is work I have to do for myself, is that it's very hard sometimes to look at the work that you're doing in this space and to not look to your side and to look to your friends and your peers who have been wildly successful, and to not be like, I've not made that, when actually, as you said, making rent, being able to look after yourself, being able to prioritize yourself. And I think one of the things collectively that we can all take from, I think, sort of breaking down that question and looking at what we think the games industry is, as opposed to sort of people who work in and around this cultural community, is supporting each other as a community and sort of being there for each other and changing that mindset a little bit. Because I think also, like, ultimately I'd say we need to reframe that question.
Yeah, the question is what's the main difference between somebody who makes it, somebody who doesn't? It's self-perception a lot of the time, because we speak of Josh Sawyer, who's made Fallout New Vegas and all of these other amazing things that you've all heard of, and he still feels that he hasn't quite made it. It's self-perception, and there are days and weeks where I think, what am I doing? Why am I still doing this? What am I doing next? What have I done? And then there are other days where I think, this feels really nice. I feel very competent. I feel like I'm in the right place at the right time, and I'm excited by my life and my career. And that shifts and changes on a whim because I'm human, because we're human. So success and what does making it mean exactly? It's sort of a strange phrase.
And I think also the thing that I really think is critical, I think, to append onto this sort of discussion is, and I think it was something I remember because I also really loved Darius's talk, is that we still have to acknowledge the multiple different privileges and biases. Like when we look at like what are the sort of defining factors of the people that we do think that have made it, or the people who we sort of hold up as those success stories, is that yes, they do skew a certain way along different privileges. That if you come from, as with any creative cultural medium, if you are somebody who is not sort of pushed to think about resources, your time and your money, that yes, you have the luxury of being in that space. And so for people out there who have those sort of additional sort of challenges and sort of I know that sort of various people on this panel will definitely sort of identify in those different spaces, that it is harder, but also that's why it's, I think, really important to sort of listen to yourself and to support yourself and to trust yourself, because there are inherent biases that are present, but also again looking out of, and I think fostering community and being aware who in your community, who within that space is also people who do not have the same privileges that you might have, that you can also help and support, because I think that is like obviously a hugely big factor as well.
Yes. I completely agree, just even from my own experience. It is very hard to accept success, actually, which seems like a ridiculous thing to say. We've got the microphones, we're at the front, we're talking to you. Like, what a privileged thing to say. But it's true in that I think having a career in this area, having a creative career, is a constantly a process. It's not a goal. It's not a state that you reach and then you are in that state of success. I've had tremendous successes, but most days I sort of feel like, oh, I really haven't done very much recently. What's my next thing? Why is nobody giving me a phone call to ask me to write music for their game? You know, like that is actually probably the majority of my feelings about my own creative career, which maybe doesn't feel very nice, but I think it's probably important to acknowledge that it is that process, it is that becoming, rather than ding, that's, yeah, you're done, you did it, you did the thing.
Because it's a creative career, because we're talking about art and an artistic sort of field, it's philosophical. You have to break down what it means to feel like you've made it before you try to define what making it means, because that's such a fluid thing.
I surveyed a bunch of game developers and just kind of asked, would you consider yourself a professional game developer? So I was just curious how they related to all those words. And I always remember the answer of one respondent, which was just, well, I've made $2 from my game, so yes. But I've made $2 from my game, so no. Think about that a lot.
We have a really great question here from Tegan, who asks, for a person who's 2 weeks away from graduation,
Congrats.
how relevant will my games design bachelor be in the future, and what should my next step be?
Highly relevant to you. Always. Well done getting your degree.
Yeah.
2 weeks.
Yeah, I mean, like, yeah, incredibly relevant, but probably not for the reasons you think it will be, almost. In the same way, my Bachelor of Arts in Creative Writing in Japanese, my half an IT degree in IT, have all been incredibly useful, but not to become a translator or to become a poet or to become a programmer. But just, it's given me a repertoire of just skills and abilities and things that, like, I find I have to do a lot of writing as an academic. A lot of academics don't actually get taught how to write. And so I have a massive advantage that I have been taught how to write, but I didn't do it for that reason. It wasn't one of the stated learning outcomes of a degree, that I would be a good academic one day. But I think like, it's why like doing, and I think something I probably could have clarified more in my keynotes, like doing tertiary education for games or anything is incredibly valuable. But again, not because there isn't a linear pipeline. So like having the time to develop a craft, having a sense of identity to fail in kind of a safer kind of environment. So all of that means that you now kind of like have a very different idea of yourself as a game developer or designer or whatever than you would have had 3 or 4 years ago. and you have a community you didn't have and whatnot. So it will be valuable. Yeah.
Sometimes, if I speak to it again, that sometimes there's this fear that like all of the software that you might get hands-on experience with at university is going to be irrelevant in 4 years. Yeah, but that's been the case for 12 years and will be the case forever. We were also facing, AI and so on now, so it's even worse than when I was a student. It's on you now to continue your learning, to keep your skills up if that's what you're interested in. But also, just leaning into saying, well, you've had this runway now of what does it feel like to be in motion as a creative person, and that's probably for me the most valuable part of a degree like that.
I think as well, being an educator as well, I think with degrees like this, and not just game dev, but most creative degrees, the significance of something that you did while a student may only become clear to you in 10 years' time. It's very hard to judge when you're right there in the moment. And so, putting an expectation on yourself right away is kind of setting yourself up to fail in that respect. So, give yourself a little time to breathe and develop and find your feet in that
Let
sense.
it cook.
Yeah, let it cook, exactly. We have we have many more upvoted questions, and I'm rapidly trying to multitask and figure out the best one to ask at this point. We have one that's been there for a little while, actually, is about setbacks. We've been talking a little bit about how to deal with success or not deal with success, or deal with the idea that you should be successful. But how do you recover from setbacks, particularly that are outside of your control? So the examples given in this question are, things like Steam repeatedly rejecting your build or publishers not getting back to you, which that last one is probably the norm.
Don't know anything about that. This is probably a good time to just lean back into the idea of this is a big part of why that community is important. You can ask the people around you for support, for advice, for a shoulder to lean on. Literally with Steam rejecting a build, for example, there will be somebody who knows what's gone on with that. It'll be some checkbox that you didn't tick, or some ratio that you didn't get quite right, or it'll be a technical thing. The publisher knockbacks. I was an independent game developer before I was at Screen Australia, and it's only now that I'm at Screen Australia and I can walk into a room full of publishers and not need to ask them for $500,000 that I can have a real conversation with them and say, what are you doing? Like, what are your deals? What are the shape of them? Why is that the case? And it's only now that I'm not out there trying to get money from publishers that I can find out how to talk to publishers as people. So, yeah, there are setbacks, and can you repeat the question? I want to get.
It was just about how to recover from setbacks that are outside of your control.
Keep going. You can't. Take some time off and stare at the sky for a bit, and find community. Lean on friends. Lean on other people, and hold out. I guess is where I was trying to wander off to with the why. Now I can speak to publishers and have these conversations when I couldn't previously. So yeah, stick it out.
Goldie, apologies for this, but I wonder, can I have a show of hands in the room? How many people came here today thinking that they wanted to be a game investment manager?
Yeah.
I'm not seeing any. Okay, how many people came in here perhaps with the idea that like they could get lots of money to make their own game? Is there any hands going up?
No.
So hands going up for that as well, but I'm just going to assume that that's second one. But isn't it, there's a really great example, Goldie, of like a job that people perhaps in this room would not be thinking about, that this really valuable skill that you've gained from that is understanding how to talk to publishers and perhaps having a really different perspective on what they're looking for and how the finance works, which who knows where Goldie's going to go sort of like next or in future in her career. But again, like how that sort of skill and that sort of like ability to approach people differently has come out of that. And I think that's a really good example. But the thing that I was going to say is like, well, how do you deal with setbacks? Like, oh my God, literally before we started this morning, I came into Goldie and I said, Goldie, I really am in need of some real cliched startup founder podcast sort of motivational talk about how you deal with rejection, because I'm going through that at the moment. Because I'm like, I need to get my groove back. How do I do it? And again, for a lot of people working sort of around curation, or people familiar with my work are like, but yeah, you've made it, you're doing great. But no, there's always going to be rejection. But one of the most valuable lessons that I've relearned, which we all know, and I knew, but you sometimes just need to live it, is like last year I had this really sort of silly, well, not silly, but really significant problem with a grant that we'd been awarded. But I had this really big sort of cash flow issue with it that I hadn't realized that I needed to sort of cash flow the grant to be able to get the money back. We won't go into the details of the way that the maths work, but I felt really embarrassed about this because I'm supposed to be a business lady. I've got we've got our studio. We've been awarded this big grant, and oh my God, are we going to have to turn this down because of this issue? And I sort of went into myself and I closed myself off and I was like, oh God, this is so embarrassing. And the thing that pulled me out was talking to people and talking to my community and talking to friends and talking to peers and saying, and just getting past that problem. And like, a problem shared is a problem halved. And oh my God, it's so true. Because as soon as I started to speak to people, I realized how many other people had the same problem, who I looked at and thought that they had their stuff sorted out and were together and like had their stuff figured out. And it turned out that it was actually a problem for loads of other companies in the region in terms of these grants. And it was something that the funders were looking at how they were approaching. So my point being that, again, it's this idea about community and spaces and being able to talk to people about the problems that you're facing, because it's very likely that other people will be facing those problems, facing those setbacks, facing those rejections, because everybody, even the successful people or people that we perceive as being successful, have been through those as well. And so I think for me, that question of how do you deal with setbacks, sort of give yourself a beat. Again, I feel like hopefully one of the mottos that's coming out of this is be kind to yourself. Know that you are not alone in facing that. You've not done something wrong or silly, but like learn from it, but also speak to people, speak to your peers, be part of those communities, think about that network that you're building, because that's where the support to keep thinking how you try again or how you reframe things or how you sort of deal with it. That's where that support comes from.
Something I find really, really, really comforting. Some kid at a party who was a little bit younger than me said this to me when I was about 24, and it's just stuck like glue, and it's really guided my whole life, is that we hear all the time, you know, how short life is. It's true until you get hit, you know, unless you get hit by a bus or something, but life's actually pretty long. Life's really long. It's the longest thing you'll ever do. Slow down and just you can relax a little bit and make plans for the long term and have longer term goals that are really ambiguous in their shape, because I don't really know what I'm doing on Saturday, but I kind of would like to have an idea of what I might be doing when I'm 60. Well, I don't, but I'd like to. But I know it's just, there's no rush. Life's long. Yeah.
And I think as well at the other, like flipping that, what you just said, Marie, as well about problem shared as a problem halved, in terms of feeling like the significance of setbacks can be, you know, earth-shattering, or, you know, I think the other thing is that nobody thinks about you or your career more than you do. And, you know, when you said you felt embarrassed, you know, probably you're the only one who kind of reached that point, right? I mean, like very few people, I think, really look at other people's careers and evaluate them, right, in that sense. So often if you're facing a setback, you know, it's something that you're focused on more than other people. Now, we've got 4 minutes and 17 seconds left. So I am going to make a big call in the asking what I think is probably going to be our last question, but we'll see, because I think it's a really good one to actually think about things in different directions and perhaps consider different pathways as well. And this is something that I know that, Brennan, you've touched on in your academic research as well. The question is, do you have any insight into what industries and employers outside the gaming industry might value game design as a skill?
Yeah, great. Yeah, it's a great question, and I believe there's some talks later today going to talk about for skill transferability and whatnot. And yeah, I mean, there's plenty, right? And probably more than you can think of. But, you know, just in terms of the hard skills, like game software, like Unity and Unreal are being used in so many other industries, you know, creative industries, but also just logistical industries or whatnot. I remember talking to educators in the Netherlands somewhere, I forget which city, and like the local like docks were using Unity to figure out simulation of what cargo crates to put on what ships or whatever, and so a lot of the game dev students were going there. The automotive industry are using them, but yeah, like both in and outside of creative industries, there's like kind of regardless of what discipline you're in games, like there's a lot of other stuff to do. Just anything. I mean, despite games not being a tech industry, they use a lot of technology. So there's a lot of adjacent tech sectors you absolutely can move into, and which probably pay a lot better as well, which is one of the challenges of the game industry, retaining talent. Look, I'm not going to give a whole bunch of specific industries, but a lot. And I think, again, like if you do creative writing, you do music, you do whatever, you're going to learn skills that do transition into other jobs, or like government jobs or investment managers and curating and whatnot. So like the skills are very transferable. And I think this goes back to like having like made it as a game developer, and like Marie's answer is so important. It's just that it doesn't need to be that you're getting paid full time doing it. It could be figuring a way to do it unpaid while you get an income somewhere else in a way that allows you to continue your craft. So the skills are incredibly transferable. And when you get that degree in game design or anything else, or you've spent a few years doing it on your own time, like you can do something with that.
I think every single game developer in the world is a very good project manager. They're good at spinning 12 plates at once because there's a lot going on to make a game run. From conception through to all of the wrangling of the design through to making the bloody thing work. We're incredibly good at complex management of complex systems of ideas, and that's transferable.
And interdisciplinary.
And interdisciplinary, yeah. You could go and start working in a hospital and figure out how to run that thing.
I don't know if I could. Marie, go run a hospital.
Pay you to do it,
Okay, I'll start doing that as my craft, like hospital running. But I guess sort of like when we talk about games, like, and again, we can focus on sort of the tech side and that side, but I think also it's really good that sort of, as Goldie said, like there's a lot of soft skills, but I think it's also worth, for me, when you're asking that question and I'm thinking about it, I'm also staring at this clock counting down, like, say this in 1 minute and 8 seconds, but it's okay because life is long. Is that games is this space where we have like, that sort of quote, like games are operas made out of bridges. We've got the art and the creative, and we've got the maths and the science and the engineering. And when we look at the world today, like understanding how to balance sort of like tech and creativity and subjectivity, oh my God, that's present in almost absolutely everything in any fields. And games are not isolated. Games are born out of like all these other industries, all these other creative mediums, and they are connected. And so there is so much more sort of transferable skills. It's not an island out by itself. There's so many ways that the things that you find that are interesting in games are present in other spaces, and do exist across other mediums and areas. Yeah.
And the thing that I would end with as well is that it might not seem like it from within the games industry, I think, because we often, I think, within the sector, we have a pretty pessimistic view of how much impact we have on society and culture more generally because of decades of being the media outrage medium of choice. But actually, games have this aura about them for a lot of creatives in other fields. And you can probably use that to your advantage. The amount of times that I've talked with somebody from like film or, traditional media, and they're like, oh my God, games. Like I heard someone give a talk about games and narrative recently, and it just blew my mind. And I know, the talk, and I'm kind of sitting there thinking, well, that wasn't really particularly anything special. But to people outside of games, actually there is this aura of newness and innovation and techiness that games have that is very appealing to the broader society. But so hopefully there are plenty of different pathways there in various different directions. Sorry if you asked a great question and didn't get to it. There's like 5 questions with more than 10 upvotes that I didn't get to, so I'm very sorry about that. But thank you for all of you for asking such great questions, and enjoy the rest of your day. Please join me in thanking Brendan, Goldie and Marie.
Thank you.